perhaps a word about these paintings. When we first put the center painting up, now a couple of years ago, I remember giving a bit of an explanation of the painter himself, and I will recap that very briefly. His name is Giovanni di Fiesoli, better known as Fra Angelico. He was a brother in the Dominican order, and in the Dominican order at that time, there was two different movements going on, like the movements going on all over the sanctuary. What are we doing here? Lots of movement. There are two different movements. One was an attempt, as often happens in religious life, an attempt to get back to the fundamentals of the religious order, to its original charism. And Fra Angelico, Blessed John, was part of that. Fiesole is a little tiny town right outside of Florence. It's the mother of Florence, basically. And so if you come down the mountain from Fiesole, you land in Florence. And on the way up there was a new convent in Fiesole, into which this man, who was known all over Florence as Il Dipintore, the painter, he was already quite famous, but wanted the life of discipleship in Jesus Christ more than he wanted painting. But at that time, you could either be a brother who was a working brother, or you could be a priest brother. If you were a priest brother, you had to preach, especially since the fact that this particular order, the Dominicans, were the order of friars preachers. And as a result, someone with his skill would not normally have gone on to be a priest. They would have employed him specifically to paint. But he didn't choose that. He went the more difficult route of being a priest, and as a result was even prior later on. Everything that he did in art was subsumed under the one charism of preaching. So what you see in his art is St. Thomas Aquinas, who was his major theologian that he studied, in art. Just as Dante is St. Thomas Aquinas in poetry. So when you look at a painting by Fra Angelico, you're seeing the master himself, Thomas Aquinas, depicted his teaching in art. It's fantastic. And the heart of St. Thomas's teaching, of course, is the incarnation of the Word, that God became man. And as a result, what you see in Fra Angelico's paintings is not the over-stylized window into heaven that you saw in the early icons of the church, where everything is gold, and the stylized figures. For example, if you look at an icon, the mouth is very small, and the reason is because you don't speak in heaven. There's nothing more to say. And the eyes are really big because you're beholding him. And the fingers are elongated, and various things that are typical of icons. But nor do you have what happened later in the late Renaissance, where all the figures were more human than divine. So before Fra Angelico, massively divine. After Fra Angelico, massively human. This is what I consider the apex of Catholic art, Fra Angelico. Now, these particular paintings. On that side and on this side, you have two scenes that are in different convents, different places, but joined by one reality, and that is a despairingly black tomb. In Greek, the word tomb is sarcophagus, which literally means a flesh eater, which is awful. And you see the blackness of that tomb as something that you and I are going to have to enter, and something that I don't want to enter. I don't want my flesh eaten. I don't want the blackness of despair. And yet Christ is not in there. He's going to go in this scene, and he's out in this one. Because what you see on this side is that already there's hints, even before he goes into the tomb of glory. For those of you on this side of the church, I'm sorry, you sat in a bad place. You already see hints of glory. So behind him is Joseph of Arimathea, holding up the body, and you can feel the weight, as it were, of Christ's body. Why? Because this is death, the wages of sin, who has taken onto himself the weight of the old man, bound to the earth, unable to rise, not able even to lift up our heads to heaven any longer. The weight even of the law, which we tempted to keep in the Old Testament but could not because of the absence of divine grace. And so everything you see in Joseph of Arimathea is a peso, a weight. And it's tempting to drag, as it were, our blessed Lord into this tomb. It's representative of the old law, of the Old Testament. But then you have our Lord's arms in the form of a cross, but so gracefully laid out. So gracefully and light and airy. And they're held up by two veiled hands on either side. One of Our Lady's and one of St. John. Our Lady, of course, always the image of the Virgin Bride, the Church. And she holds that hand ever so slightly and is attempting, as it were, to bend over to kiss the sacred hands. And John on the other side doing the same thing. She an image of the Church, John an image of the priesthood. And in between, this sacrifice that is going on, but so gracefully. And where that sacrifice emits its grace, you see the flowering, the new earth, as it were, a celestial city. So underneath his hands, you notice that all of the grass is beginning to flower once again with new life. And the flowers are coming up, and it's a sign, of course, of the re-entrance into paradise. That where that grace falls, life again is engendered. Now, why the veils? You think, why does Our Lady herself attempting to kiss his hands, not even touching them herself? She who bore that body in her own body, she who gave him, as it were, that body, why doesn't she touch him with her own hands? It's not because in the Old Testament you weren't allowed to touch a body, a dead body, because you'd be made unclean. On the contrary, this body is still alive. Yes, he has died. But as the scriptures say, you did not allow my soul nor my body to undergo corruption. That Christ was preserved even in the tomb from death, because that body, although dead, is still united to his divinity. There was no sarcophagus. There was no eating of his flesh. On the contrary, that consecrated flesh is only eaten by us, not by a tomb. You and I receive Most Holy Communion, and in doing so, I can't have him in the way of a normal body. It's always veiled. We approach it, as the religious do, with our hands underneath our scapulars, as it were. Why? Because I can't actually have him the way I touch someone else. I have him through the mediation of the Holy Eucharist. And yet it is his true body, his true blood, and we do so with absolute reverence, always veiled, because I do not yet have him in the way that I will in heaven, when all veils are removed. But I do have him truly. Thus the scene over here. Now our Lord, without that peso of the body, without that weight of the body, is floating, as it were, on top of tulips, walking across the grass. The original is a bit more, obviously, the Master himself, a bit more effortless in his walking. And he's gracefully gliding across the grass, and he has his hand down here, of course. And the scene is when our Lord says, "Noli mi tangere," do not cling to me. Do not touch me. Magdalene, do not try to have me in the way that Joseph of Arimathea has me over here, dragging around what he thinks is nothing but a lifeless body. Do not take upon yourself the weight again. You must seek me and have me through a sacramental means, through the cross that's coming over here and dripping with divine love. That's the way you will find me now. And so Magdalene becomes an image of the church insofar as now we seek him, not the way we would have anyone else in terms of relationship, but seek him in the sacraments. To have him most truly, the one who is the conqueror of death, who walks away from the blackness of the tomb, shaking himself, as it were, with life, and giving that life to all to whom he encounters.